July 24, 1943. 11:18 p.m., over Hamburg, Germany. The night sky burns red. Incendiaries fall like meteors, igniting rooftops, rail yards, and warehouses below. Air raid sirens scream over the roar of engines, hundreds of them, the steady drone of RAF Lancasters stretching across the heavens. Anti-aircraft flak bursts in black puffs all around, but strangely, the German searchlights are unfocused. Their beams sweep frantically, catching nothing but the glint of falling metal fragments. Inside Lancaster, O for oboe, Flight Lieutenant Peter Langridge grips the yoke with white-knuckled hands. His eyes flick between the altimeter and the glowing radar scope mounted beside him. The German radar network should have seen them by now. Yet somehow, they've made it this far without interception. Navigator, report, Langridge barks over the intercom. Dead on course to Hamburg, replies Sergeant McLeod, his voice calm but laced with disbelief. No night fighters on the radar. Nothing. Langridge glances out the cockpit window. Normally, by this point in the run, they'd be under siege, chased by Messerschmitt Bf 110s guided by the German Freya and Würzburg radar systems. Tonight, it's eerily quiet. Then the radio crackles, Bomber Command HQ back in England. A clipped, confident voice comes through. Window is working. Repeat, window is working perfectly. Langridge frowns. Window? He's heard whispers about it in the briefing room at RAF Scampton, something about metal foil, top secret, hush-hush. But now, as he peers through the canopy, he sees it for himself. Thousands upon thousands of thin strips float through the air, shimmering, twisting, drifting down like confetti from the heavens. They glint in the firelight below, silver against the black sky. To the Germans, their radar scopes have just exploded into chaos. Each tiny strip of aluminum reflects radar waves the same way a bomber does. Instead of a few hundred aircraft, their screens now show tens of thousands of ghostly echoes. The enemy can't tell what's real and what's illusion. Langridge's Lancaster continues undetected through the shimmering haze of falling foil. Below, the Würzburg radar operators shout in confusion. Their instruments are blind. Inside a radar bunker outside Hamburg, Oberleutnant Franz Keller slams a fist on the console. The once clear blips of the incoming bombers have vanished into a storm of static. Every sweep of the radar arm paints the screen with phantom aircraft. His superior leans in, sweating under the dim red light. Are they jamming us? Keller shakes his head. Neen, something else. The sky, it's full of echoes. Back over the city, the bomb bays open. Langridge steadies his bomber. The red glow of the inferno below reflects off the aluminum storm falling from above. Bombs away, he calls. The payload drops, high explosives, incendiaries, and another cascade of foil. The night becomes a nightmare of light and smoke. On the ground, Hamburg burns. In the sky, British crews silently thank the faceless scientists, the Boffins, as they called them, who'd given them an invisible shield. None of the airmen that night truly understand how it works. They only know one thing: for the first time in years, the bombers have the upper hand. And somewhere, deep inside Britain's coastal laboratories, a small team of eccentric geniuses is already preparing the next step in a war fought not with bullets, but with waves, wires, and invisible trickery. The age of electronic warfare has just begun. July 25, 1943. 2:40 a.m., Malvern, England. While Hamburg burns hundreds of miles away, a quiet celebration ripples through the corridors of the Telecommunications Research Establishment, the British nerve center of radar innovation. Cigarette smoke hangs thick in the air. Coffee cups and scribbled blueprints litter the desks. A tall, bespectacled man in a rumpled tweed jacket, Dr. Robert Watson Watt, the father of British radar, stands before a glowing oscilloscope. The rhythmic green pulse of a radar trace dances across the screen. For the first time in months, he allows himself a weary smile. Behind him, Dr. Joan Curran, a physicist with a sharp mind and quicker wit, sets down a sheaf of test reports. They said it was too simple to work, she murmurs, watching the screen flicker. Turns out simplicity is harder to detect than complexity. Watson Watt chuckles. Window, he says, almost affectionately. A curtain of metal chaff that blinds an empire. The British scientific community had long been fighting its own secret war, one fought in laboratories instead of trenches, with equations instead of rifles. Since 1935, radar had been Britain's great invisible shield, detecting Luftwaffe bombers long before they reached English soil. But by 1943, Germany had developed its own advanced radar systems. The skies over Europe had become a deadly game of hide-and-seek played with electromagnetic waves. That's where the Boffins came in, the slang term airmen used for their odd, brilliant, and often socially awkward scientists. They were mathematicians, engineers, and physicists recruited from universities and research institutes. Some were barely out of college, others, veterans of pre-war radio labs. And they worked miracles. At Malvern, Dr. Curran and her husband Sam Curran had been experimenting with radar countermeasures since early 1942. One afternoon, while studying reflected radar signals, Joan had an idea so absurd that her colleagues laughed, until it worked. What if, she suggested, we dropped something that could reflect radar waves, something small, metallic, and numerous enough to flood their screens? The idea seemed ridiculous. The German Würzburg radar systems were tuned to specific wavelengths. But when Joan cut strips of aluminum foil, each exactly half the radar wavelength long, the effect was astonishing. On the screen, the foil appeared identical to an aircraft. By the summer of 1942, the first tests were conducted over the English countryside. RAF pilots dropped handfuls of the metallic strips, and radar operators below watched their instruments fill with ghost planes. It was elegant. Cheap. Devastating. They called it window. But there was a catch. The very same technique could be used against Britain. If the Luftwaffe discovered it first, the chain-home radar stations that guarded the English coast could be blinded just as easily. For almost a year, the weapon was kept under strict secrecy, debated fiercely in smoky war rooms across London. Marshal of the RAF Sir Arthur Bomber Harris had been begging for it. "We're sending boys to die while we hold the key to confusing the enemy," he protested. But Prime Minister Winston Churchill hesitated. If the Germans learned the trick, they could devastate Britain's defenses. The cabinet weighed the risks, and waited. That was, until the summer of 1943, when intelligence reports confirmed what the Boffins had long feared: the Germans were already experimenting with their own version. The decision was made. Operation Gemara, the bombing of Hamburg, would be Window's first test in combat. And as the radar screens in Hamburg went white with confusion, the Boffins at Malvern listened to the first reports filtering back from the field. Minimal fighter interception, came one transmission. Flak erratic. Accuracy high. It was the proof they needed. Their invisible weapon had worked. But as the scientists celebrated quietly, none of them could shake a troubling thought: what they had just unleashed wasn't merely a trick of physics. It was a turning point in how wars would be fought forever. Invisible. Electronic. Deceptive. And they had only just begun to explore what the electromagnetic spectrum could do to a battlefield. Autumn 1940, a year before Window was even a whisper. Long before the skies above Hamburg turned silver, the war for the invisible spectrum had already begun. It was called the Battle of the Beams, a shadow war of radio waves, deception, and ingenious countermeasures that turned Britain into the world's first laboratory for electronic warfare. In those dark months after the fall of France, when the Luftwaffe dominated the skies, British radar scientists discovered that the Germans were guiding their bombers not by sight, but by beams of radio energy. The system was called Knickebein, or crooked leg. Two high-frequency beams, transmitted from stations in occupied Europe, crossed over a target city in England. When a bomber followed one beam and heard a signal in its headset, it would stay on course. When the second beam's tone merged with the first, the aircraft was over the target, and the bombardier released his payload. To the untrained ear, the system seemed unstoppable. Invisible lines of sound in the night sky, leading hundreds of bombers precisely to their marks. But in a dimly lit room in London, a small team of scientists gathered around a radio receiver, listening intently. Among them was Dr. R. V. Jones, a young intelligence officer from the Air Ministry's Scientific Intelligence Division, a man with a sharp mind and a sharper tongue. He leaned over the receiver, headphones pressed to his ears. "They're using our own navigational frequencies," he murmured, almost amused. "We can jam this." By the end of that week, British engineers had set up mobile transmitters to broadcast fake signals, mimicking and distorting the German beams. The Luftwaffe's precise navigation turned to chaos. Bombers overshot their targets, dropped early, or missed entirely. The British called it bending the beams. And for the first time, scientists weren't just helping the war, they were fighting it. As the months went on, the electronic battle grew more complex. The Germans responded with new systems, X-Gerät, Y-Gerät, and even Corfu, each more advanced, more precise, more secret. The British countered with new jammers, decoys, and listening posts hidden in barns, church towers, and coastal cliffs. The entire landscape of southern England became an invisible front line. Dr. Jones and his small team of Boffins, a mix of academics, radar operators, and eccentric engineers, worked tirelessly to intercept, analyze, and defeat the next wave of German technology. They slept in shifts, surviving on tea and adrenaline, often under the threat of air raids themselves. Jones later described it as a duel between minds, rather than machines. By the time of the Blitz, British scientists could predict, and counter, nearly every German electronic system. When the first V-1 flying bombs appeared in 1944, radar-guided anti-aircraft guns were already waiting. But as Britain mastered the art of jamming enemy signals, one challenge remained unsolved: how to hide from radar altogether. That's what led Watson Watt, Curran, and the others at Malvern down the path toward Window. It wasn't just about confusing the enemy anymore. It was about vanishing completely, creating the illusion of 1,000 bombers, while the real ones slipped unseen through the noise. The Battle of the Beams proved one thing: in modern war, invisibility wasn't a matter of camouflage or darkness. It was about controlling what the enemy saw, and what they believed. And by 1943, Britain had turned deception into an art form. Yet as effective as Window was, it was still only one weapon in a growing arsenal of invisible tricks. In the coming months, the Boffins would push their inventions even further, from radar countermeasures to entire fake fleets and phantom armies. And their greatest masterpiece would come not in the skies over Hamburg, but on the beaches of Normandy. May 1944, south coast of England. Fog clings to the cliffs above Dover. Beneath it, rows of Sherman tanks gleam under camouflage nets. Except, they aren't tanks. They're made of canvas and air. Nearby, soldiers hammer stakes into the ground, stretch fabric over wooden frames, and spray the illusion with mud for realism. At a glance, and especially from the sky, the scene looks like an invasion force massing for war. But it's a mirage. Every sound, every movement, every radio transmission here is part of one of the most elaborate deceptions in military history, Operation Fortitude, a massive Allied plan to convince the Germans that the D-Day invasion will strike Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. And at its heart are the same British scientists who once dropped bits of foil over Hamburg. Inside a sealed hut along the coast, the Boffins, physicists, signal officers, and sound engineers, work beside camouflage experts and stage designers from the film industry. Together they form what American troops will later nickname the Ghost Army. Think of it as theater, says Major Jasper Maskelyne, a professional illusionist turned military deception specialist. Only our audience carries machine guns. Their props are staggering in scale: inflatable tanks that can be deflated and moved in hours, wooden trucks that cast perfect shadows, fake landing craft built from canvas and scaffolding. Even the engine noises are faked. Enormous loudspeakers play recordings of tank columns, while engineers rotate the tracks of empty vehicles to leave convincing marks in the dirt. But the true brilliance isn't what the Germans can see. It's what they can detect. Upstairs, in a cramped radio shack, engineers mimic the electromagnetic chatter of a real army, coded messages between fake divisions, radar reflections from fabricated fleets, and false signals bouncing across the channel. They use a new technique, derived from window, to simulate radar echoes. Sheets of metallic foil, cut to specific lengths and arranged in patterns, create the illusion of entire convoys moving along the coast. German radar operators monitoring from Calais see what looks like an enormous invasion fleet assembling just a few miles away. Every sweep of their radar tells the same story: the Allies are coming to Calais. Meanwhile, far to the west, the real invasion force gathers quietly in the harbors of southern England, hidden behind weather fronts and radio silence. The success of this deception depends on absolute precision. Even the timing of false transmissions must match what German intelligence expects from a real army preparing to move. To the Luftwaffe's reconnaissance aircraft, everything appears consistent: the tanks, the tents, the radar blips, the coded chatter. Back in the darkened rooms of the telecommunications research establishment at Malvern, Joan Curran and her team monitor the German radar responses intercepted by British listening stations. They compare patterns, verify distortions, and adjust signal strength. It's the same cat-and-mouse logic that birthed Window, but now scaled to deceive an entire nation. By late May, Allied intelligence confirms it's working. German High Command, including Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, remains convinced that the invasion will strike Calais. They even withhold key panzer divisions from Normandy, waiting for the main attack that never comes. On the night of June 5, 1944, the eve of D-Day, the final phase of the deception begins. RAF bombers flying over the Channel release vast clouds of Window in precise, geometric patterns. On German radar screens, the reflected signals look unmistakable: dozens of ships moving toward Calais. While the real invasion fleet sails invisibly toward Normandy, a phantom armada glides through the night sky, carried on waves of electromagnetic trickery. From their radar bunkers along the French coast, German operators watch the blips grow closer. Multiple contacts approaching Calais sector. Confirm speed and bearing. It's the invasion, alert the coastal batteries. Searchlights sweep the empty waters. Guns open fire at shadows. By dawn, the deception is complete. When the first Allied soldiers land on the beaches of Normandy, German commanders still believe it's a diversion, that the real assault is yet to come. The Boffins' invisible war has bought the Allies the most precious commodity of all, time. And in that time, the tide of the entire Second World War will turn. Summer 1944, TRE Laboratories, Malvern Hills, England. The war in Europe rages on, but inside the quiet laboratories of the Telecommunications Research Establishment, TRE, another kind of battle continues, fought not in cities or skies, but on oscilloscopes and radio benches humming with static. The same scientists who invented Window are no longer satisfied with confusing the enemy. They want to make British aircraft disappear altogether. Dr. Joan Curran, sleeves rolled up and hair tied back, stands before a cluttered workbench. She's surrounded by a small team of engineers and physicists, some fresh from Cambridge, others veterans of radar development since the war's earliest days. In her hand is a small black box, its lid engraved with the initials ARQ. Inside, a tangle of wires and vacuum tubes hums faintly. "This," she says, "is how we vanish." The device is an experimental radar jammer, a new generation of airborne countermeasure capable of sending back false radar echoes. Unlike Window, which fills the sky with noise, this machine can selectively create fake targets, masking the real aircraft beneath layers of interference. Her husband, Sam Curran, adjusts the dials on a radar receiver nearby. A green trace flickers across the scope. "Signal clean," he says. "Let's see what the Germans make of this." Joan flips the switch. The trace on the oscilloscope suddenly explodes into static. The single bright dot representing their test target splits into a dozen ghostly echoes, each drifting in different directions. "Now imagine that multiplied by 100, she says quietly. "They'll never find us." This was the next phase of Britain's invisible war, a transition from passive deception to active manipulation. Radar countermeasures evolved from simple foil strips into electronic devices with names like mandrel, carpet, and jostle, each designed to jam, confuse, or overload the German radar network. Mandrel blanketed enemy receivers with a storm of static, rendering long-range detection useless. Carpet was carried by bombers, flooding radar frequencies with chaotic pulses. Jostle, the largest of them all, was mounted in modified bombers and used to overpower entire communication bands. To the Germans, these signals appeared as technical nightmares, instruments overloaded, screens blinded, systems crippled. To the British, they were symphonies of survival, composed by mathematicians and conducted in the electromagnetic ether. Every new German radar innovation, from the Liechtenstein night fighter system to the Freyja early warning network, was met with a new British countermeasure within weeks. And it wasn't just about radar anymore. The Boffins were experimenting with infrared detection, magnetic navigation disruption, even radio wave camouflage coatings. The dream of true invisibility, of aircraft that could fly undetected, was no longer fantasy. By late 1944, experimental units of the RAF's 100 group were outfitted with entire suites of electronic warfare gear. Their mission, to shield bomber formations with invisible curtains of interference, masking the force behind a fog of radio deception. Flight Officer Alan Fisher, a wireless operator aboard a modified B-24, later described it in his logbook. The Germans couldn't tell what was real anymore. Their scopes were full of ghosts. We were ghosts ourselves. The scientists of TRE knew that their inventions didn't just protect lives, they altered the very rules of warfare. Battles were no longer won solely by firepower, but by information, by perception, by controlling what the enemy believed was true. Joan Curran, who had once cut bits of foil with kitchen scissors to confuse radar, now found herself at the heart of a revolution in military science. When the Allies crossed into France, her work, and the work of hundreds like her, had already saved thousands of lives. But she never sought glory. When interviewed years later, she simply said, "All we ever wanted was to help our boys come home alive." In a war that had revealed humanity's darkest capacities, these quiet figures, the mathematicians, physicists, and radio engineers, had fought their own battle for light. Their weapons were invisible. Their victories, silent. And their legacy would reach far beyond the Second World War, into every radar system, stealth aircraft, and satellite network that followed. For they had discovered something profound, that in modern war, power lies not in what can be seen, but in what can be hidden. February 1945, over the Ruhr Valley, Germany. The moon is veiled in cloud. Below, the heart of Nazi industry, steel mills, refineries, and ammunition plants, glows faintly in the distance. Overhead, the sky hums with the heavy drone of Allied bombers. Inside Lancaster, F for Freddy, squadron leader Harold Mason scans his instruments. The radar warning receiver, a new addition, courtesy of the Malvern Boffins, remains silent. That's a good sign. It means the German night fighter radar hasn't found them. Steady as she goes, Mason mutters. "We're ghosts tonight, lads." The crew chuckles softly, though the tension is palpable. Everyone knows how many aircraft never return from the Ruhr. But this time feels different. Somewhere behind the roar of the engines, the cold mathematics of radio science is protecting them. From his station, wireless operator Corporal Eddie Willis monitors a panel of dials connected to a jamming set codenamed Carpet 2. The device emits bursts of static precisely timed to match the enemy radar frequency. Every pulse of the machine is a shield, an invisible wall of confusion spreading across the German night. "Mandrel active," Willis calls. "We're blind to them now." Far below, in a radar station near Duisburg, German technicians frantically adjust their controls. The green sweep of their Würzburg scopes is useless, filled with blizzards of false echoes. "Too many contacts," shouts one operator. "It's impossible to separate them." His superior leans over the console. "Try the reserve set. Use Liechtenstein band." They switch frequencies, but the static follows. British bombers have adapted, matching every move. By now, the electromagnetic war has become a high-speed duel fought in microseconds. Each time the Germans shift to a new frequency, the British jammers lock on. When the Luftwaffe tries a countermeasure, the Boffins at Malvern and RAF 100 Group devise a response within days. It's a dance of invisible combatants, a war of engineers, not infantry. Above, Mason's crew presses onward. "Coming up on the target," calls the bombardier. "No searchlights, no fighters." Mason nods grimly. Then Window's done her job. From the bomb bay, another cascade of silver foil pours into the darkness. The sky glitters, billions of tiny mirrors catching what little moonlight filters through the haze. Below, the German radar network drowns in illusion. Screens flicker with phantom squadrons. Entire formations appear where none exist. For the men in the air, it feels like witchcraft. For the scientists back in Britain, it's simply physics, waves reflecting waves, chaos born of precision. But even as British crews celebrate their newfound advantage, the Germans are not idle. In a fortified laboratory outside Berlin, engineers of the Luftnachrichtendienst, the Luftwaffe's radar research branch, gather around a blackboard scrawled with equations. At the center stands Dr. Wolfgang Martini, chief of radar development. His hair is gray, his eyes exhausted. He's been studying captured fragments of Window, analyzing its dimensions. "They're using half-wavelength cuts," he says softly. "It's elegant. Too elegant." One of his aides, a young physicist, sighs. "Can we counter it, Herr Doctor?" Martini hesitates. "Perhaps, but not quickly. The English think faster than we can rebuild." He's right. By 1945, German radar technology, once ahead of the world, is collapsing under the relentless ingenuity of Britain's scientific war machine. Every attempt to restore order is drowned in a tide of noise, deception, and interference. And as the RAF's bombers rain destruction on the Reich's last industrial strongholds, the Boffins of Malvern know that their invisible hand guides every mission. They've made radar, once the Germans' greatest advantage, their enemy's greatest vulnerability. When dawn breaks over the smoldering Ruhr, Mason's Lancaster limps home on 2 engines. He stares out the window at the rising sun, the horizon streaked with silver. "Looks like foil," he murmurs. "Looks like hope," replies Willis. For the men in the air, Window is just a simple trick, a handful of shining paper that confuses machines. But for the scientists behind it, it's proof of something far greater, that in the modern world, wars are not only fought with steel and fire, but with the unseen patterns that govern them. And in those patterns, Britain had found its greatest weapon, invisibility. May 1945, London, England. The war is ending. Across Britain, bells ring and crowds pour into the streets. Flags wave, champagne flows, and for the first time in 6 years, the skies above the capital are free of the menace of warplanes. But in a quiet corner of Malvern, far from the cheers of victory in Europe Day, a handful of scientists stand together on a grassy hill overlooking the valley. The war they fought was waged in silence, and though their weapons never fired a bullet, their fingerprints are all over the outcome. Dr. Robert Watson Watt lights a cigarette, squinting against the morning sun. Beside him, Joan and Sam Curran share a rare moment of rest, holding hands as they gaze at the sprawling research buildings below. Joan exhales slowly. "So it's really over," she says. Watson nods. "For now." But the waves don't stop when the guns fall silent. He's right. The victory of 1945 isn't just a military one, it's the birth of a new kind of warfare. A war fought with information, signals, and deception. The British called their scientists Boffins, a nickname born from affectionate mockery, but history would remember them as the architects of modern electronic warfare. During the 6 years of conflict, they transformed radar from a crude early warning tool into a weapon of precision and deception. They learned to see through clouds, to detect submarines beneath the waves, to blind enemy sensors, and even to fake entire armies from thin air. Every bomber that returned home safely from Germany owed part of its survival to their inventions. Every German radar station that faltered was a victory of their intellect over brute force. Now, as peace settles over Europe, the same minds who made radar invisible are already thinking ahead. Dr. R.V. Jones, the mastermind of the Battle of the Beams, is briefing Allied intelligence officers on the future of electronic countermeasures. He warns them that radar, and its defeat, will define every war to come. Meanwhile, the Currans begin work on new technologies to harness atomic energy and subatomic particles, applying their wartime experience with waves and fields to peaceful science. But not all of their work can remain peaceful. In secret government facilities, radar experts begin studying ways to detect aircraft from even greater distances, and ways to hide from detection altogether. Stealth, though not yet named as such, is already in its infancy. For the first time, military power depends not only on firepower or manpower, but on knowledge, on the ability to see the enemy before being seen, to deceive before being struck. The invisible war of radar and radio had changed everything. June 1945, Berlin, Germany. In a captured German laboratory, British and American officers sift through piles of documents. Radar sets lie scattered across tables, prototypes of advanced systems the Nazis never completed. Among them is a small crate labeled Täuschung, German for deception. Inside, Allied engineers find a curious surprise: bundles of fine metal strips, cut to precise lengths, German window. They had discovered the same idea. Watson later wrote in his report to the Air Ministry. "It is a sobering reminder that the enemy walked the same paths of discovery we did. The difference lay in how we used them, decisively, and first." The war of radar had been a duel of intellects as much as nations. The British had won not by brute strength, but by wit, by daring to think differently. August 1945, Malvern, England. A new project file lands on Dr. Watson Watt's desk: Microwave Research, Civil Applications. It outlines plans to adapt wartime radar technology for weather forecasting, air traffic control, and even cooking. He laughs softly, setting the paper down. From bombers to breakfast, he muses. For Joan Curran, the war's end brings quiet satisfaction, and lasting humility. In her post-war writings, she never sought credit for window. She called it a small contribution, made by many hands. Yet her simple strips of aluminum had saved thousands of airmen, blinded the enemy, and reshaped the future of military science. The world that emerged from the Second World War was built not only on victory and reconstruction, but on a revolution of perception, one forged by Britain's secret Boffins, who turned the invisible into a battlefield. As the sun sets over the Malvern Hills, Watson gazes at the horizon, his cigarette burning low. He speaks softly, almost to himself. Invisibility was never magic. It was understanding. For 6 years, Britain's brightest minds had mastered that understanding, turning waves into weapons, and deception into salvation. They had made radar invisible to the Germans. And in doing so, they had changed the nature of war forever.